from whispered conspiracies in Khorasan to revolutionary banners of black. The Abbasids transformed the Islamic world through blood and vision. After toppling the Umayyads in 750, they shifted power eastward, founding Baghdad, the Round City, as civilization's new center. Under visionaries like al-Mansur and Harun al-Rashid, their empire fused Arab faith with Persian administration, creating a golden age where knowledge flourished. The House of Wisdom translated ancient texts, while physicians, astronomers, and mathematicians pushed humanity forward. Though weakened by civil war and provincial rebellions, their legacy endured even after Baghdad's catastrophic fall to Mongol horsemen in 1258, a dynasty that reimagined what Islamic civilization could achieve. It began with whispers carried along the dusty roads of Syria and Iraq, murmurs of injustice that grew louder in the markets, the mosques, and the caravanserais. The Umayyads, who had ruled for nearly a century, appeared unshakable, their palaces gleaming in Damascus, their armies feared across continents. Yet beneath the marble and mosaic, resentment festered. The empire had been built on conquest, but it was governed by favoritism. Arab tribes, particularly those of Syria, received privileges that Persians, Berbers, and other new converts to Islam could only envy. The Mawali, those non-Arab believers who had embraced the faith, were still taxed like outsiders, treated less as brothers in religion than as subjects to be managed. In the garrison towns of Iraq, bitterness hardened into opposition. Farmers muttered about heavy levies, merchants grumbled at inequities, and scholars denounced the moral corruption of rulers who claimed descent from the Prophet's family, but lived like worldly monarchs. Each injustice was a stone laid upon the growing cairn of discontent, and by the 740s, the mound was ready to topple. Far away in Khorasan, the northeastern province where mountains rose like fortresses and winds carried the chill of Central Asia, the seeds of rebellion took root. It was there that the Hashemiyya movement found its true power. Originally a secret society of Shia sympathizers, it had long whispered of a new order. It promised justice, fairness in taxation, equality among believers. Most of all, it promised a ruler who would be closer to the Prophet's household than the Umayyads could ever claim. Over time, the Hashemiyya banner became fused with another, that of the Abbasid family, who traced their bloodline to Al-Abbas, the Prophet Muhammad's uncle. This connection offered legitimacy without the sharp exclusivity of claiming descent from Ali. In the villages of Khorasan, recruiters moved in secrecy. They wore plain garments, spoke in measured tones, and carried with them a sense of inevitability. To each audience, they tailored their message. To the Persians, they spoke of ending Arab domination. To the devout, they promised a purer Islam. To the weary soldiers, they offered the chance of plunder and redemption. It was a campaign not of swords at first, but of stories, persuasion, and carefully tended hope. Into this simmering world stepped Abu Muslim, a man whose origins were clouded by mystery, but whose presence soon became legend. Some claimed he was Persian, others that he was Arab, but none could deny his charisma. He moved through Khorasan like a spark in dry brush, igniting loyalty wherever he went. His followers saw him as a chosen figure, a commander who embodied both cunning and compassion. With patience, he drew together a coalition of Persians, weary of subjugation, Arabs disillusioned with Damascus, and even Turks eager for a role in the great struggles of Islam. The Khorasani army that emerged under his leadership was unlike any other in the Islamic world. It was a tapestry of cultures and tongues. its ranks filled with men who might once have faced each other across battlefields, but now swore oaths together beneath black banners. They trained in harsh conditions, their discipline enforced as much by Abu Muslim's charisma as by any whip. For many, fighting under his command was not only an act of defiance but of faith. In the year 747 AD, revolt erupted. Villages declared for the Abbasids, black standards were unfurled, and the call to arms swept through Khorasan like a sandstorm. The Umayyad governor, caught off guard, faltered in his response. Rebel victories followed, each one feeding the sense that destiny itself favored them. By 749 AD, the armies of Abu Muslim were no longer a provincial nuisance but a force poised to challenge the very heart of the empire. The decisive confrontation came in January 750 on the banks of the Great Zab River in northern Iraq. The Umayyads gathered their forces, a vast host with armored cavalry and veterans of many campaigns. Opposite them, the Khorasani troops stood resolute beneath their black banners, their ranks bristling with determination. Snow lay on the hills, the river ran cold and swift, and the air carried the silence of men preparing for slaughter. When the battle was joined, the field erupted into chaos. Arrows darkened the sky, horses screamed, and the clash of steel echoed across the valley. The Khorasanis fought with a fury born of long grievances. Accounts tell of Persians and Arabs charging side by side, of Turks breaking the enemy's cavalry lines. By the day's end, the Umayyad army was shattered, its remnants fleeing towards Syria. The riverbanks were strewn with the dead, and the empire of Damascus teetered on the edge of ruin. The victors pressed their advantage. Marching towards Syria, they found city after city unwilling to resist. Fear of Abu Muslim's army, coupled with hatred for the Umayyads, cleared the way. Damascus, jewel of the Umayyad dynasty, stood as the final prize. There, a grim reckoning awaited. When the Abbasids entered the city, they sought not merely victory, but eradication of their rivals. The princes of the Umayyad house, those who had once dined in gilded halls and ruled from Damascus, were hunted down. In one infamous gathering, dozens of them were invited to a banquet under the guise of reconciliation. Instead, they were slaughtered, their blood staining the floors of their ancestral palace. The dynasty that had stretched from Spain to India was reduced in a single day to corpses and fugitives. Still, one man escaped the carnage. Abd al-Rahman, a young prince who fled across deserts and mountains, pursued relentlessly by assassins. His survival would one day give birth to an Umayyad revival in distant Spain. But for now, the East belonged to another power. In the aftermath, the Abbasid cause needed a figurehead. The choice fell upon Abu al-Abbas, remembered in history as al-Safa, the bloodshedder. He was proclaimed caliph in Kufa, his authority wrapped in both lineage and victory. For those who had endured the weight of Umayyad oppression, his name carried the promise of justice and renewal. For his enemies, it foreshadowed vengeance. The revolution was complete. The Umayyads had ruled like kings of Damascus. The Abbasids would claim to rule as leaders of the entire Islamic world. Their banners of black became symbols of a new age, fluttering above mosques and palaces, carried along roads that stretched from the Oxus to the Nile. Still, the triumph carried shadows. The brutality at Damascus left scars. The reliance on men like Abu Muslim revealed a tension that could not be easily resolved. Power won by the sword might one day turn against its master. Yet in 750 AD, few could imagine such futures. The Abbasid dynasty had been born in fire and blood, and for a time it seemed unassailable. In the streets of Kufa, where al-Safa received the oath of allegiance, crowds chanted blessings and raised their hands toward heaven. A new caliphate had begun, one that promised fairness to converts, justice for the oppressed, and a vision of universal leadership. The Abbasids claimed not merely to succeed the Umayyads, but to restore Islam to its rightful path. Whether they would keep that promise was a story for another time. For now, the fall of Damascus was the fall of an age. In its ruins, a new empire prepared to rise, one whose capital would soon eclipse every city of the Islamic world. Baghdad, still unbuilt, lay ahead. The House of Wisdom had yet to open its doors. But the first stones of the Abbasid legacy were already in place, set upon the banks of the Zab and sealed in the blood of princes. The throne of the Caliphate passed, as it always did, with the weight of expectation and the shadow of betrayal. When al-Safa was raised as the first Abbasid Caliph in 750 AD, the air was thick with the memory of blood. His title, the Bloodshedder, seemed less a boast than an omen, for his reign began with massacre and ended with vengeance. Yet it was also brief. Within 4 years, his role as the founding figure was eclipsed by another, a man colder, sharper, and infinitely more enduring, Al-Mansur, his brother and successor. In the early years, the new dynasty needed to prove that it was not merely a reaction to the Umayyads, but a legitimate inheritance of the Prophet's mission. Al-Safa proclaimed himself the protector of the oppressed, a defender of converts who had been scorned under Damascus's rule. He distributed largesse to soldiers and courtiers, rewarding those who had carried the black banners across Khorasan. Crowds in Kufa hailed him as the chosen one, though whispers lingered that it was Abu Muslim's charisma and armies that had made the victory possible. Even as celebrations filled the mosques, danger lingered in the provinces. The Umayyads were broken, but the Alids, descendants of Ali and Fatima, remained. To their supporters, it was not the Abbasids, but the House of Ali that held the rightful claim to lead the faithful. Their cause had long been intertwined with the Hashemiyya movement, and many had assumed that the revolution would deliver the throne into Alid hands. The disappointment was bitter, and from that bitterness sprang rebellion. The first Abbasid Caliph died in 754 AD, his reign a brief spark that ignited the long flame of the dynasty. The succession of al-Mansur brought a different temperament to power. Where his brother had reveled in generosity and spectacle, al-Mansur was austere, calculating, and ruthless. He grasped that the caliphate could not survive on enthusiasm alone. It required discipline, surveillance, and a state apparatus stronger than the loyalties of tribes. Al-Mansur's first challenge came from within the very coalition that had raised his family to power. Abu Muslim, hero of Khorasan, entered Iraq at the head of armies that adored him. He was more than a general. He was a symbol of Persian pride, of the inclusiveness promised by the revolution. Crowds shouted his name with a fervor that made the new caliph uneasy. Al-Mansur welcomed him with honors, listened to his counsel, and then, when the moment was right, destroyed him. In 755 AD, Abu Muslim was lured into a private meeting, accused of treason, and struck down. His body was cast into the Tigris, his memory preserved only in whispered laments, and the anger of those who had believed in him. The execution shocked the empire, but it also revealed al-Mansur's cold genius. He understood that no dynasty could tolerate a second power at its heart. Abu Muslim had been indispensable to victory, but in victory he became intolerable. With his removal, the Abbasid Caliphate belonged fully to its own family, no longer balanced precariously between Arab commanders and Persian rebels. Rebellions flared nonetheless. In 762 AD, Muhammad al-Nafs al-Zakiyah, an Alid claimant, rose in Medina, proclaiming himself the true leader of the faithful. His brother Ibrahim rallied forces in Basra. Together, they threatened to ignite a civil war that could have undone the Abbasids before they were firmly rooted. But al-Mansur moved with speed. Troops were dispatched, the Alid armies scattered, and both brothers were killed. The message was unmistakable. The Abbasids would brook no rival claims, no matter how noble the lineage. Amid the bloodshed, al-Mansur pursued another vision, the creation of a new capital that would embody Abbasid power. Damascus was discarded, its memory tainted with Umayyad arrogance. Kufa and Basra were dismissed as unstable, too bound by tribal loyalties. Instead, al-Mansur turned his gaze north, to the banks of the Tigris, where rivers met and trade routes converged. There, in 762 AD, the foundations of Baghdad were laid. The city was unlike any the Islamic world had yet seen. Designed as a perfect circle, it became known as the Round City, its geometry a symbol of order imposed upon chaos. Massive walls rose in concentric rings, pierced by 4 monumental gates, each opening toward a different horizon of the empire: Khorasan, Syria, Basra, and Kufa. Within those walls stood palaces, mosques, and markets, their construction consuming the labor of thousands and the wealth of provinces. Al-Mansur poured fortune into this city, declaring that Baghdad would be the heart of his dynasty. Costly as it was, the project served more than vanity. Its central location allowed rapid communication across the empire. Its proximity to the old Persian capitals signaled continuity with Sasanian grandeur, and its design offered both defense and prestige. By the time the Caliph took up residence, Baghdad was already humming with life. Merchants arriving from India with spices and silk, scholars carrying texts from distant lands, and pilgrims stopping on their way to Mecca. The consolidation of power extended beyond walls and marble. Al-Mansur established the Barid, a postal service that was far more than a courier system. Messengers carried not only letters, but reports, intelligence, and secrets. Provincial governors were watched, generals monitored, and even distant villages surveyed. Information became the lifeblood of the state, flowing constantly toward Baghdad. With it, the caliph's hand could reach into every corner of his dominion. Bureaucracy swelled. Persian administrators, heirs to centuries of imperial governance, filled offices with meticulous records and precise tax rolls. Arabic remained the language of scripture and law, but the techniques of administration owed much to the legacy of Persia. Under al-Mansur, the Caliphate ceased to be a tribal empire and became a state. It was a transformation as radical as the revolution itself, for it turned conquest into governance and ideology into institution. In the mosques of Baghdad, preachers praised the Caliph as the shadow of God on earth. Al-Mansur himself cultivated a careful image, projecting humility in his personal life while ruling with an iron will. He traveled on pilgrimage to Mecca, binding his authority to the sacred rites of Islam. Yet at home, he oversaw the execution of rivals and the silencing of dissent. It was a balance of piety and power, one that gave the Abbasids an aura of legitimacy unmatched by the shattered remnants of their enemies. Still, the cracks were never far from view. Some still mourned Abu Muslim, others clung to the Alid cause, and tribal divisions persisted despite new claims of universal brotherhood. But al-Mansur's genius lay in keeping these tensions contained, never allowing discontent to ignite into uncontrollable fire. Through ruthlessness, surveillance, and relentless centralization, he ensured that the Abbasid throne endured. By the time of his death in 775 AD, al-Mansur had transformed the caliphate from a revolutionary movement into a dynasty with roots deep enough to weather storms. He left behind a capital destined to rival Rome and Constantinople, a bureaucracy that bound provinces together, and an image of caliphal authority that would endure for centuries. The Abbasid caliphs who followed would adorn Baghdad with learning, luxury, and legend. But the foundations of that grandeur, the discipline of rule, the silencing of rivals, the centralization of power, were laid by a man remembered less for generosity than for endurance. If al-Safa was the flame that lit the Abbasid torch, then al-Mansur was the iron that kept it burning steady, bright, and unyielding. At dawn, mist rose from the Tigris and settled like a veil upon the plain. Beneath that shifting haze, men labored with spades and hammers, their cries echoing across the open ground. From the center of that dust and sweat, a dream was taking shape, a city unlike any other, conceived not only as a capital, but as a statement. This was to be the round city of Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasids, a city planned with compass and vision, raised to proclaim a new order to the world. Al-Mansur had chosen the site with the precision of a general. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates flowed nearby, bearing merchants and armies alike. The old Persian capitals of Ctesiphon and Seleucia were within sight, their ruins reminders of grandeur that still lingered in memory. To build here was to announce continuity with the empires that had once ruled from Mesopotamia, while claiming something entirely new. The foundations stretched wide, laid out in a circle more than 2 kilometers across. Engineers and astrologers were consulted, the stars charted, the soil tested. 4 colossal gates were positioned at exact intervals, each pointing to a cardinal direction, each opening toward one of the empire's great regions. The gate of Khorasan looked east toward Persia and beyond to Central Asia. The gate of Syria faced west toward Damascus and the Mediterranean. To the south, the gate of Basra led to the Gulf and the Indian Ocean, and the gate of Kufa opened toward the holy cities, toward the deserts and Mecca itself. Within those gates, walls rose high and thick, encircling the city like the rim of a crown. At the center stood the Caliphal Palace, the Golden Gate, its domes rising above all else. From that heart radiated avenues like the spokes of a wheel, ensuring that all movement, whether of merchants or soldiers, converged upon the throne. This was not merely architecture, it was ideology built in brick. The Caliph stood at the center of the world, and all roads led to him. The cost of such ambition was staggering. Contemporary accounts speak of sums reaching 100 million dirhams, poured into foundations, walls, canals, and palaces. Entire villages were emptied of workers, caravans brought timber from distant forests, and boats carried marble and tile along the rivers. Dust filled the air, cranes creaked, and hammers struck stone by day and by night. Out of that chaos rose symmetry, order imposed upon the land by the will of the Caliph. Soon the circle filled with life. Markets sprang up, their stalls groaning with goods, silks from China, spices from India, furs from the steppes, and glassware from Syria. The clang of coppersmiths mixed with the cries of camel drivers. The call to prayer echoed from new mosques, mingling with the chatter of scholars debating in shaded courtyards. Water flowed through newly cut canals, feeding gardens where date palms and pomegranates grew. Travelers arriving through the gates marveled at the walls and domes, whispering that no city could rival this vision of order and abundance. Baghdad grew quickly, far beyond its planned circle. Suburbs spilled outward, Villages merged into districts, and bridges carried the crowds across the river. Within a generation, the city had become one of the largest in the world, a hub where languages, faiths, and cultures met. To walk its streets was to hear Arabic beside Persian, Greek beside Syriac, Hebrew beside Turkish. Pilgrims rubbed shoulders with merchants, soldiers with poets, peasants with philosophers. In this ferment, the Abbasid caliphs found not only prestige, but a practical strength. By drawing people from every corner of the empire, Baghdad became a mirror of the caliphate itself, diverse, restless, and constantly alive. To govern it was to govern the empire in miniature. Central to this new order was the integration of Persian traditions. Administrators from noble Iranian families filled the bureaucracy, bringing with them the refinement of Sasanian governance. Record-keeping, taxation, and court etiquette blended with Arab ideals, creating a hybrid culture both efficient and grand. The Abbasids proclaimed themselves heirs of the Prophet, but in their palaces they also echoed the kings of Persia. Among those administrators rose the Barmakid family, descended from Buddhist custodians of a shrine in Balkh, who had embraced Islam and risen to prominence in the Abbasid court. Their skill in finance, their patronage of scholars, and their influence over caliphs made them indispensable. Under their guidance, Baghdad's administration expanded, its wealth carefully managed, its institutions strengthened. For a time, the Barmakids seemed the very embodiment of Abbasid cosmopolitanism, open to every current of learning and devoted to the prosperity of the caliphate. The city itself was a living canvas of culture. Poets recited verses in the bazaars, storytellers enchanted children with tales of distant lands, and philosophers gathered in private houses to discuss texts arriving in translation. Even in its earliest decades, Baghdad was already becoming more than a political capital. It was a place where knowledge was sought, where manuscripts changed hands as eagerly as spices and jewels. Al-Mansur had laid the first stones, but after his death, his successors carried forward the vision. Al-Mahdi, his son, adorned the city with palaces and gardens, seeking to embody the caliphate's magnificence. Harun al-Rashid, whose name would one day be immortalized in legend, brought further splendor. Each generation added domes, libraries, and mosques, until Baghdad shimmered like a mirage upon the riverbanks. Yet beneath the luxury lay fragility. The wealth that flowed into Baghdad often bypassed the provinces, leaving distant regions to grumble under the weight of taxation. Soldiers stationed far away wondered why their sacrifices built palaces for others. Local dynasties began to sense opportunities, even as the caliphate projected an image of unbroken unity. For now, however, the splendor dazzled all who came near. Travelers from Byzantium returned home with tales of markets vaster than Constantinople's. Pilgrims from Arabia spoke of libraries where Greek and Indian manuscripts were gathered. Merchants from China praised the bridges and canals that made the city a true hub of the Silk Road. To outsiders, Baghdad was more than a city. It was a wonder, a vision of what empire could achieve when ambition met faith. In the glow of its rising domes, the Abbasids seemed unassailable. Their banners flew from North Africa to Central Asia, their authority reinforced by both mosque and palace. Baghdad embodied the promise of their revolution: equality for converts, justice in governance, and grandeur to rival the empires of old. But history, even in its moments of triumph, carries seeds of decline. The same cosmopolitanism that enriched Baghdad also bred rival ambitions. Families like the Barmakids, so vital in building the state, would one day clash with jealous caliphs. Provinces drawn into the orbit of the capital would later strain against its pull. For the moment, however, none of this was visible. To those who stood on the Tigris in the late 8th century and gazed upon the round city's glittering domes, it seemed that the Abbasid dynasty had achieved perfection. The center of the world had shifted. No longer Damascus, no longer Ctesiphon, but Baghdad, a city where merchants, poets, and pilgrims gathered, where the Caliph ruled as both heir of the Prophet and lord of a vast earthly dominion. The gates of the round city stood open, welcoming caravans and emissaries from every corner of the known world. Within its walls, the Abbasids proclaimed a golden age, one that would dazzle generations with its splendor. The story of Baghdad was only beginning, and with it, the tale of a caliphate that sought to unite faith, empire, and knowledge at the very heart of the Islamic world. Night in Baghdad was never truly dark. Lamps burned in the courtyards of palaces, torches lined the riverbanks, and the domes of the round city shimmered in moonlight like bowls of silver. From behind latticed windows drifted the sound of lutes and poetry, while on the streets below, merchants still haggled by lantern glow. It was in this city of endless light that Harun al-Rashid reigned, the caliph whose name would echo not only in chronicles, but in tales whispered to children and sung by storytellers. His court became the stage upon which the Abbasids displayed their wealth, their power, and their contradictions. Harun came to the throne in 786 AD, inheriting an empire at once magnificent and fragile. His father, al-Mahdi, had adorned Baghdad with palaces and strengthened the caliphate's prestige. His brother, al-Hadi, had ruled briefly, dying young and leaving the path open. Harun himself was no stranger to war. As a prince, he had led campaigns against Byzantium, securing tribute that enriched the treasury and burnished his reputation. When he became caliph, he carried with him the aura of both soldier and sovereign. From the first, he set out to embody the ideal ruler. Baghdad under his reign shone with splendor. Courtiers wore silks woven with gold, servants carried jeweled vessels, and poets competed to capture the magnificence of the caliph's majlis. The empire's wealth streamed into the city, taxes from Egypt's fertile fields, caravans of silk and spice from the east, and tribute from Byzantium itself. Chroniclers tell us that when Harun sent a gift to Charlemagne, ruler of the Franks, it included a water clock that struck the hours with mechanical birds and knights, leaving its recipients awestruck. And yet, amid this opulence, Harun was also remembered for his piety. He performed the Hajj to Mecca not once, but multiple times, traveling with vast retinues and distributing alms to the poor along the way. These pilgrimages were no mere devotions. They were political theater, reminders that the Caliph was not only the master of Baghdad's palaces, but also the servant of God at the Kaaba. In these journeys, soldiers marched beside scholars, courtiers mingled with pilgrims, and the empire was bound together under the sight of its ruler at prayer. The court itself glittered with intrigue as much as jewels. Ministers vied for influence, poets sought patronage, and rival factions whispered in corridors. At the heart of this swirl stood the Barmakids, the family whose rise had been meteoric under al-Mansur and al-Mahdi. As viziers, they wielded immense authority, managing finances, advising on policy, and patronizing scholars. Their houses were said to rival the caliphs in magnificence, their generosity legendary. They became patrons of literature, medicine, and philosophy, turning Baghdad into a beacon of culture. For a time, their partnership with Harun seemed perfect. The caliph could devote himself to the grandeur of rule, while his viziers ensured that the empire's machinery ran smoothly. But such power was perilous. By 803 AD, suspicion clouded the bond. Harun, perhaps fearing their influence, perhaps resenting their independence, struck decisively. In a single purge, the Barmakids were cast down. Their palaces were seized, their fortunes confiscated, their leading figures imprisoned or executed. The fall of the Barmakids sent shockwaves through the empire, a reminder that no family, however indispensable, could rival the caliph. The reasons for their downfall remained shadowed. Some said they grew too proud, others whispered of plots. Still others believed Harun acted from cold calculation, cutting down the very men who had helped make his reign secure. Whatever the truth, their fall marked a turning point. The caliphate lost some of its stability, for the Barmakids had been not only administrators, but bridges between Arabs and Persians, courtiers and scholars. Their absence left a gap that no successor filled so completely. While intrigue filled Baghdad's halls, Harun's gaze also turned outward. The empire under his rule stretched vast, and keeping it whole demanded both diplomacy and war. With Byzantium, he alternated between campaigns of steel and treaties sealed with tribute. The great empress, Irene, sent envoys to Baghdad, bearing gifts and proposals. Later emperors faced his armies on the frontier, but often chose gold over blood, agreeing to send yearly payments to avert devastation. These victories fed the caliph's treasury and his prestige, reinforcing the image of an empire both feared and respected. His attention reached westward as well. Charlemagne, the Frankish king, crowned emperor by the Pope, exchanged embassies with Harun. The gifts that crossed between Baghdad and Aachen became legends in themselves. The water clock, silks, spices, even an elephant named Abul Abbas that astonished Europe. In return, Charlemagne promised aid for Christians in the Holy Land, recognizing in Harun a fellow ruler of near equal majesty. These exchanges linked the Abbasids not only with neighboring Byzantium, but with distant Europe, weaving Baghdad into the tapestry of medieval diplomacy. Yet even in this age of brilliance, shadows grew. Harun's wealth and generosity could not conceal the empire's strains. Baghdad's magnificence rested on revenues from distant provinces, and resentment simmered among those who felt exploited for the capital's glory. The reliance on Turkish slave soldiers, the Ghilman, began to shape military life, planting seeds that would later transform the caliphate's power. In the provinces, local leaders tasted autonomy, their loyalty to Baghdad more fragile than the caliph might wish. Harun's reign, for all its splendor, also prepared the ground for conflict to come. In his final years, he faced the challenge of succession. To avoid rivalry, he sought to divide authority between his sons, Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun. One would rule from Baghdad, the other from Khorasan. On parchment, it seemed a careful balance, a solution to preserve unity. In practice, it was the spark of civil war, for no dynasty could endure two centers of power without friction. When Harun died in 809 AD, he left behind more than treasures and palaces. He left an empire radiant yet divided, admired yet vulnerable. To the people of Baghdad, his reign was remembered as a golden moment. Nights filled with poetry, days bright with processions, markets swollen with wealth. To later storytellers, he became the Caliph of Wonder, appearing in the pages of The 1001 Nights, listening to Scheherazada's tales beneath the lamps of his palace. But history offers no fairy tales unbroken. Behind the legend of Harun al-Rashid lay the truth of an empire at its height, yet already straining at its seams. The fall of the Barmakids, the reliance on distant revenues, the division between his sons. These were cracks in the facade. Baghdad glowed with light, but beyond its gates, storm clouds gathered. For now, however, the image endured. A caliph walking the markets in disguise to hear his people's troubles. A ruler whose gifts astonished foreign kings. A sovereign whose city seemed the very center of the world. Harun al-Rashid embodied the zenith of Abbasid majesty, the point at which the caliphate seemed invincible. The brilliance of his reign would cast long shadows in the years to come. The death of Harun al-Rashid in 809 AD left an empire glittering with wealth, yet shadowed by uncertainty. He had been both soldier and patron, a ruler whose reign seemed unshakable. But the arrangement he crafted for succession, dividing power between his two sons, proved fatal. It was meant to preserve unity, to prevent jealousies and rivalries. Instead, it lit the fuse of a conflict that would scar the Abbasid world for generations. The elder son, Al-Amin, ruled from Baghdad itself. Groomed in the heart of the round city, he was steeped in the culture of court, surrounded by Arab courtiers and advisors who encouraged his claim to sole power. His younger brother, Al-Mamun, held Khorasan, that distant and restless province whose soldiers had once delivered the Abbasids to victory. In theory, the brothers were to cooperate. Al-Amin recognized as Caliph, Al-Mamun as heir and governor of the East. But theory rarely survives ambition. For a time, the arrangement held. Envoys traveled between Baghdad and Merv. Letters exchanged pledges of loyalty, and the empire's machinery continued to turn. Yet behind the formalities, mistrust deepened. Al-Amin's advisors urged him to secure the succession for his own son, cutting Al-Ma'mun from the line. Khorasan's notables whispered that their governor should not merely serve as second, but as equal, even as rightful ruler. The empire had been split along its deepest fault line, the center in Iraq, with its Arab elite, and the east, where Persian traditions and loyalties ran strong. By 811 AD, the fragile pact collapsed. Al-Amin moved openly to exclude his brother, declaring his own child as heir. Al-Ma'mun, reluctant at first, was pushed into rebellion by the urging of his advisors, most of all the brilliant general Tahir ibn Hussein, whose skill would prove decisive. The caliphate, barely 2 generations old, now found itself at war with itself. The conflict was not merely dynastic, it was cultural and regional. Baghdad rallied Arabs who feared losing dominance, while Khorasan supplied Persian converts and seasoned soldiers who resented being treated as second class. Black banners of the Abbasids faced other black banners, brother against brother, both claiming the same legacy, the same right, the same divine mandate. The war unfolded with grim momentum. Battles flared across Iran and Mesopotamia, armies clashing along riverbanks and desert roads. In 812 AD, Tahir's forces swept toward the capital, surrounding Baghdad itself. What followed was one of the most harrowing episodes in the city's history, the Siege of Baghdad. For over a year, the city endured hunger, disease, and devastation. Its gardens were stripped bare, its markets emptied, its people reduced to desperation. Neighbors turned on each other for scraps of food. Corpses lay unburied in the streets. Chroniclers describe the Tigris running low, its banks lined with makeshift defenses, its waters clogged with wreckage from skirmishes. Al-Amin, once surrounded by splendor, now found himself trapped within walls that had been symbols of strength transformed into a prison. Inside, morale collapsed. Factions among the defenders quarreled, supplies dwindled, and the population grew weary of a ruler who could no longer protect them. Outside, Tahir tightened his grip, cutting lines of supply and bombarding the city. By September 813 AD, the siege reached its end. Al-Amin attempted escape by river, hoping to rally loyalists elsewhere, but fate and Tahir had other plans. He was captured, brought before the general, and executed. His head was sent to Al-Ma'mun as proof that the war was over. Baghdad lay broken, its streets scarred, its people embittered. The capital that had once seemed the invincible heart of empire had endured starvation and ruin at the hands of the caliph's own kin. Al-Ma'mun now reigned as caliph, recognized across the empire, yet his triumph carried costs that could not be erased. The civil war had sapped the strength of the state, weakened its central authority, and exposed the divisions within its society. Baghdad, though it remained the capital, had witnessed the fragility of its own grandeur. Al-Ma'mun himself, however, emerged not only as victor, but as a ruler of remarkable vision. From his base in Khurasan, he had absorbed Persian intellectual traditions, surrounding himself with scholars, theologians, and scientists. He favored men of learning, often more than men of arms. His court would become renowned as a center of inquiry, where Greek texts were translated, astronomical instruments refined, and debates over theology and philosophy flourished. The scars of civil war did not extinguish his ambitions, they sharpened them. Still, suspicion lingered in Baghdad. Many saw him not as the natural heir of the Abbasids, but as a provincial usurper, one who owed his throne more to Khurasani arms than to caliphal legitimacy. To ease tensions, Al-Ma'mun attempted gestures of reconciliation. He brought notable families into his administration, distributed wealth to the city, and staged ceremonies to restore the image of unity. Yet distrust endured, for memories of famine and betrayal cannot be erased with coin or ceremony. The conflict between Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun left deep fissures in Abbasid rule. The authority of the caliph, once imagined as absolute, now seemed negotiable. Provincial elites had seen their power. Generals had tasted the ability to make or unmake rulers. The caliphate would never again wield the same effortless dominance it had in the days of Al-Mansur or Harun. And yet, paradoxically, the very weakness of the throne opened new spaces for cultural brilliance. Al-Ma'mun, perhaps recognizing that political unity was fragile, sought instead to strengthen the intellectual and spiritual prestige of his dynasty. The wounds of war bled into a hunger for knowledge, a determination to show that even if the sword faltered, the pen could still shine. Thus the civil war ended, not with the destruction of the Abbasid dream, but with its transformation. The round city, battered but not broken, would soon hear the voices of philosophers and physicians, mathematicians and astronomers. The age of Harun had been an age of splendor and intrigue. The age of Al-Ma'mun would be one of books, debates, and discoveries. The death of Al-Amin closed one chapter of Abbasid history in blood. The victory of Al-Ma'mun opened another, filled with both promise and peril. Civil war had revealed the fragility of the empire, but it also prepared the stage for its most dazzling intellectual flowering. Baghdad was still healing when Al-Ma'mun settled upon the throne. The siege that had delivered him power left scars on the round city. Houses charred, gardens stripped, families broken by hunger. Yet amid these ruins, the caliph envisioned not merely recovery, but transformation. Where his brother had perished amid factional strife, Al-Ma'mun sought to bind the empire with something stronger than steel. He turned his gaze toward knowledge, believing that wisdom could achieve what armies could not. From the moment he entered the capital, scholars clustered around him like moths to flame. He had been shaped by Khorasan's cosmopolitan air, where Persian, Arab, and Greek traditions mingled, and he carried that inheritance with him. His court became a gathering place for translators, philosophers, and scientists, men whose tongues carried the words of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and Euclid into Arabic. At the center of this vision stood the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. More than a library, it was a workshop of ideas, a place where scribes hunched over manuscripts from Greece and India, where mathematicians argued beneath oil lamps, and where physicians dissected the wisdom of Galen to apply it to the fevers and fractures of Baghdad. Scrolls that had once lain, neglected in monasteries of Syria or academies of Byzantium, now found new life in Arabic script. The translation movement gathered momentum with breathtaking speed. Ptolemy's Almagest was rendered into Arabic, its star charts re-examined beneath the skies of Mesopotamia. Euclid's Elements became a textbook for students who had never seen the Mediterranean. The works of Galen, carried through Syriac intermediaries, entered hospitals where Abbasid physicians tested theory against the reality of plague and childbirth. To Baghdad came also Indian texts, treatises on mathematics, medicine, and astronomy that enriched the growing corpus of knowledge. Among those who carried this vision forward were the Banu Musa brothers, sons of a court astronomer. Gifted and ambitious, they became known for inventions as dazzling as they were ingenious, fountains that seemed to run by magic, mechanical devices powered by hidden principles, and treatises on geometry that blended mathematics with artistry. In their work, one sensed the Abbasid conviction that the natural world was a puzzle to be solved, a treasure house of secrets waiting to be unlocked. This pursuit of knowledge was not idle curiosity. Astronomy guided the determination of prayer times and the direction of Mecca. Medicine promised relief from the epidemics that swept through cities. Mathematics sharpened the tools of administration and taxation. Even philosophy served a purpose, offering frameworks to defend Islam against skeptics and rival faiths. For al-Mamun, the scholar was no less vital than the soldier, for both defended the caliphate, one with the sword, the other with the pen. The caliph himself took personal interest in these pursuits. Chroniclers tell of him commissioning astronomical observations, sending expeditions to measure the circumference of the earth, and ordering debates between theologians in his palace. He saw himself as a patron of reason, a guardian of inquiry, a ruler whose authority was strengthened by the flourishing of the mind. But intellectual daring carried risk. The more scholars probed into Greek philosophy, the more they encountered ideas that unsettled tradition. Could reason stand alongside revelation? Could the eternal word of God, the Quran, be subjected to the logic of philosophers? Such questions could not be confined to lecture halls. They reached the heart of faith itself. Al-Mamun, convinced of the truth of rationalist theology, chose to intervene. He embraced the doctrines of the Mu'tazilites, who argued that the Quran was not eternal, but created in time. To them, this preserved the unity of God. For if the Quran were co-eternal, it risked placing another being beside the divine. To their opponents, however, such a claim was heresy, undermining the very foundations of Islam. In 833 AD, Al-Mamun launched the Mina, an inquisition designed to enforce this doctrine. Judges, scholars, and officials were summoned and questioned. Was the Quran created, or was it eternal? Those who refused the Mu'tazilite position faced dismissal, imprisonment, even flogging. The Caliph, who had championed translation and debate, now demanded conformity, convinced that reason itself was a tool of state. The Mihna shocked the scholarly world. Some complied reluctantly, others resisted fiercely. Among those who suffered was the jurist Ahmad ibn Hanbal, whose refusal to bend made him a symbol of defiance. Crowds whispered his name, admiring his courage, even as he languished in prison. The very effort to enforce unity through reason ended by deepening divisions, setting scholars against rulers, theologians against philosophers. Meanwhile, beyond Baghdad, the Caliphate's grip wavered. Campaigns against Byzantium drained resources. The attempt to extend authority into frontier regions met with stubborn resistance. Al-Ma'mun's intellectual brilliance could not erase the political realities of an empire stretched thin, its provinces restless, its generals ambitious. Yet even as the military frontier faltered, the intellectual frontier surged. Manuscripts multiplied, debates flourished, and the foundations of Islamic science and philosophy were laid more securely than walls or fortresses. The contradictions of Al-Ma'mun's reign were stark. He was the caliph who patronized knowledge, yet punished dissent, who welcomed Greek philosophy, yet demanded dogma, who envisioned unity, yet presided over lingering fractures. His decade on the throne reshaped the Abbasid identity, turning Baghdad into the beacon of learning that later generations would call the world's wonder. When he died in 833 AD, the caliphate was poorer in stability but richer in wisdom. The House of Wisdom stood as his monument, a treasury of translated texts and original treatises that would echo far beyond Baghdad. Through those works, the names of Greek philosophers survived into the Latin Middle Ages. Through those experiments, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics found new life in Europe centuries later. Al-Ma'mun's reign revealed both the promise and peril of binding empire to intellect. He proved that power could be exercised not only through armies, but through ideas, that a caliph could be as much a patron of scholars as a commander of soldiers. Yet he also showed the danger of forcing thought into dogma, for inquiry thrives in freedom and withers under coercion. The Abbasid Caliphate had endured civil war, and from its ashes, it now gave birth to an intellectual golden age. The siege of Baghdad had nearly destroyed the round city, but the House of Wisdom would raise it higher than armies ever could. Under Al-Ma'mun, the Abbasids ceased to be merely rulers of territory. They became curators of civilization. The courtyards of Baghdad filled with voices, not of soldiers, but of scholars. Under vaulted ceilings and beside the shaded banks of canals, men leaned over manuscripts, argued in circles, and scribbled calculations on tablets. The empire that had once defined itself by conquest now pursued triumphs of another kind, victories of mind and method. In this atmosphere, Al-Khwarizmi emerged, a mathematician whose name would echo across centuries. His treatises on algebra did more than solve equations. They forged a new discipline. He sought methods that could apply universally, devising ways to balance unknowns with knowns, to resolve debts, inheritances, and trade accounts with certainty. His work, transmitted through Latin centuries later, would give Europe the very word algorithm, a distant echo of his name. Philosophy, too, found a voice in Al-Kindi, the thinker called the philosopher of the Arabs. He translated Aristotle into Arabic not merely as exercise, but as a bridge between revelation and reason. To him, truth was not divided. It could be gleaned through both scripture and intellect. His essays ranged from music to optics, from the properties of jewels to the workings of the soul. In his study, Greek thought mingled with Islamic theology, producing syntheses that astonished and unsettled his peers. The study of medicine reached new heights under Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a physician and translator whose Greek and Syriac heritage made him a conduit of knowledge between worlds. He gathered Galen's works, corrected them, and rendered them into Arabic with clarity. His influence reached hospitals that the Abbasids built in their cities, institutions far more than places of healing. They became schools where students observed patients, copied manuals, and debated treatments. The very structure of modern medical training owes something to these wards where theory met practice. In the hospitals of Baghdad, Al-Razi would later carry medicine further still. His eye was sharp, his notes meticulous. He distinguished measles from smallpox, identified the properties of alcohol as antiseptic, and experimented with chemical substances that hinted at modern pharmacology. Chroniclers recall his compassion for patients, his willingness to admit uncertainty, his insistence that observation should guide the physician more than authority. To his contemporaries, he was both healer and heretic, praised for his skill, yet criticized for his boldness in questioning dogma. Astronomy flourished as well. Al-Battani, born in Harran, measured the heavens with precision, refining Ptolemy's charts, adjusting the length of the solar year, and calculating eclipses with uncanny accuracy. His observations, centuries later, would guide Copernicus and the navigators of Europe. His work proved that the Abbasid court had not merely preserved ancient knowledge, but had extended it, correcting the ancients with instruments and reasoning more exact than before. Other sciences blossomed in tandem. Students of optics experimented with lenses and light, probing how vision functioned. Chemists, inspired by Jabir ibn Hayyan, explored substances and transformations, some sincere, others wrapped in secrecy and allegory. Geographers charted rivers and mountains, describing lands as far as China and the Atlantic, expanding the mental map of the world. In every direction, the Abbasids pursued knowledge as though empire itself depended upon it. Learning was not confined to scholars alone. The streets of Baghdad echoed with storytellers, whose tales mingled fact and fable. Libraries welcomed students from distant lands. Paper, imported from China and manufactured in Baghdad's mills, multiplied the reach of manuscripts. Where parchment had been costly and scarce, paper allowed books to spread like leaves in the wind. For the first time in Islamic history, learning became something that could circulate widely, not locked in monasteries, but carried through markets. This efflorescence, however, carried tension. Rationalist theologians, emboldened by the Mu'tazilite creed, pressed their claim that reason should shape doctrine. Traditionalists resisted, holding fast to revelation as absolute. In Baghdad's mosques, fiery sermons denounced philosophers as corrupters, while in palaces, caliphs continued to fund translators and mathematicians. The conflict was not only intellectual, but social. One vision sought to bind faith with logic, the other to guard it from intrusion. Debates could be fierce, yet they rarely stifled the flow of knowledge. Even as jurists resisted the mihna, physicians dissected medical texts. While preachers thundered against foreign philosophy, astronomers aligned their astrolabes. The very friction between reason and tradition fueled further inquiry, forcing scholars to sharpen their arguments, to define their methods more clearly, to articulate the value of their pursuits. The Abbasid caliphs remained central as patrons. Their courts dazzled with poets and scholars alike. Rulers sent emissaries to distant lands in search of books. Greek manuscripts were purchased in Byzantine markets, Indian works carried overland by caravans. Knowledge became a prize of empire, as valuable as gold or silver, and Baghdad became its treasury. By the mid-9th century, the Abbasid world seemed unrivaled in learning. Hospitals treated the sick with methods unknown elsewhere. Mathematicians invented techniques that would underpin centuries of science. Philosophers engaged with Aristotle and Plato as if they were present in the room. From the banks of the Tigris, ideas radiated outward, carried by merchants and pilgrims, echoing in Cairo, Cordoba, and beyond. And yet, brilliance was not without fragility. Patronage depended on the whims of caliphs, who might elevate a scholar one day and condemn him the next. The growing use of Turkish military slaves gave generals new power, shifting attention from books to swords. Provinces, restless under taxation, cared little for philosophy in Baghdad. The golden light of learning shone brightest in the capital, while the empire beyond remained troubled. Still, to those who walked the streets of Baghdad in the 9th century, the sense of living at the center of knowledge was unmistakable. Students debated beneath the arches of mosques. Physicians tended patients in wards filled with books, and astronomers lifted their instruments to the night sky. The Abbasids, once conquerors of land, had become conquerors of thought. The story of this flourishing did not end with harmony. Rationalists and traditionalists would clash more fiercely, and the state's embrace of reason would eventually give way to caution. Yet for a generation, Baghdad embodied the dream that faith and intellect might stride together, illuminating the world more brightly than any lamp upon its streets. In the mid-9th century, Baghdad glittered with unmatched brilliance, though outside its gates, unseen tides began to shift. The provinces that once fed the round city with wealth and grain began to assert their independence. What had seemed a seamless empire in the days of Harun and al-Ma'mun now revealed itself as a patchwork of ambitions. Egypt was the first to test the limits of loyalty. Fertile fields along the Nile yielded immense revenues, long coveted by the caliphs. Yet governors stationed in Fustat began to behave less as deputies and more as princes. In 868 AD, Ahmad ibn Tulun, a Turkish officer, seized effective control of the province. He built his own capital at Al-Khatai, raised an army loyal to himself, and even constructed the great mosque of Ibn Tulun, whose spiraling minaret proclaimed his permanence. Though he paid lip service to Baghdad, Egypt in truth had slipped beyond its grasp. Farther west, North Africa moved on a similar path. In Ifriqiya, the Aghlabid dynasty rose to prominence, ruling from Kairouan with nominal recognition of Abbasid authority. Their ambitions stretched across the sea. By 827 AD, they launched fleets into the Mediterranean, seizing Sicily from Byzantine hands and establishing a base that would dominate the Central Sea. Caravans carried news of their victories back to Baghdad, but the caliphs could claim little credit. The banners might still bear Abbasid names, yet the spoils enriched local rulers. Eastward, new powers emerged just as boldly. In Transoxiana, beyond the Oxus, the Samanid dynasty built a realm steeped in Persian culture. They patronized poets and scholars, reviving Farsi as a literary language, even as they acknowledged Abbasid suzerainty in theory. In the mountains of eastern Iran, the Saffarids, founded by Yaqub ibn al-Layth, a coppersmith turned warlord, carved out dominion with sword and audacity. Their rise signaled that even humble men could found dynasties when the caliph's hand grew weak. The Abbasids themselves, seeking to manage this vast realm, relied increasingly on the iqtar system, granting governors and commanders rights to collect taxes from lands in lieu of salaries. At first pragmatic, the practice soon bred autonomy. Provincial leaders treated the revenues as their own, funding palaces and armies without reference to Baghdad. What had been an imperial mechanism turned into a license for independence. Meanwhile, Iraq itself groaned under strain. The intricate irrigation networks that had turned Mesopotamia into a garden of abundance were faltering. Overuse and neglect left canals clogged, fields salinized, villages abandoned. Tax burdens grew heavier as revenues shrank, driving peasants to desperation. Into this misery erupted the Zanj Rebellion of 869 AD, a rising of African slaves forced to toil in the marshes and salt pans near Basra. For more than a decade, the rebels defied caliphal armies, establishing fortified camps, plundering towns, and threatening even Baghdad. Their revolt revealed not only the brutality of slavery, but also the vulnerability of an empire stretched thin. To suppress such unrest, the Abbasids turned ever more to military slaves, Mamluks drawn from the steppes of Central Asia. Trained in loyalty to their masters, these soldiers became the backbone of the Caliphal Guard. At first, they provided stability, protecting rulers from conspiracies and rebellions. Yet their growing power made them arbiters of succession, kingmakers within the palace. The caliphs who once commanded armies of tribes now found themselves dependent on foreigners who might obey or depose them. The weakening of central authority was not only political, but cultural. While Baghdad remained a beacon of learning, the provinces began to cultivate their own centers of brilliance. In Nishapur, poets flourished under Samanid patronage. In Kairouan, jurists established schools of law. In Cairo, under Ibn Tulun and his heirs, architecture and scholarship bloomed. The Abbasid Caliph remained a figure of reverence, but increasingly as a symbol rather than a sovereign. The Mediterranean itself reflected this shifting balance. Sicilian conquests enriched North Africa, while raids reached as far as Italy. Muslim fleets harried the coasts, establishing footholds that startled Christendom. Yet these ventures owed more to Aghlabid initiative than to Baghdad's direction. The caliph's name was invoked in sermons and coinage, but real power lay with men who rarely looked east for instruction. Through it all, Baghdad glittered on the surface. The House of Wisdom continued to expand, markets remained crowded, and palaces echoed with music. But beneath the splendor lay fragility. Taxes were harder to collect, soldiers harder to control, and provinces harder to command. The round city that had once been the unquestioned hub of empire now competed with capitals that claimed loyalty in word but acted in independence. Chroniclers of the age sensed the change. Where once they described a caliph commanding vast armies, they now noted generals acting on their own. Where once they praised the caliph's justice, they now recorded the arrogance of provincial dynasties. The Abbasid dream of universal rule had not vanished, but it had fractured. By the close of the 9th century, the map of the Islamic world told the story plainly. Egypt, North Africa, and Persia each bore rulers who acted as sovereigns. Iraq itself trembled under revolt and economic decline. The caliphate had not collapsed, but its unity was shattered. Even so, in this fragmentation lay paradox. Local dynasties, though politically independent, continued to acknowledge the caliph's spiritual primacy. His name was recited in Friday prayers, inscribed on coins, invoked in treaties. The Abbasid Caliphate, though weakened, retained a symbolic gravity that no provincial ruler dared ignore. Thus, the age of provincial powers began, an era when the Abbasids no longer commanded as emperors, but endured as symbols. Their authority was diminished, yet their prestige endured. The Golden Age had not ended, but its sheen was now contested, dulled by rebellion, revived by learning, and carried forward by provinces that both defied and upheld the caliph's name. The streets of Baghdad still astonished visitors. Caravans arrived with silks from the east, and glass from Syria, and the domes of the round city gleamed over the Tigris. To a traveller newly arrived, the Caliphate seemed unbroken, its capital still the centre of the world. Yet for those who lived within its walls, the shimmer concealed decay. The caliphs of the 10th century presided over a stage set, their authority more ceremonial than real, their city caught between grandeur and fragility. Power had slipped from the palace into the hands of others. The Turkish officers who once guarded the caliphs had grown indispensable. Their soldiers, raised as slaves but trained as elite warriors, filled the barracks and patrolled the streets. They answered not to the caliph, but to their commanders, and their presence turned Baghdad into a city of uneasy silences. A caliph might give orders, but if the generals frowned, those orders evaporated into air. The throne of the prophet's heir had become vulnerable to the whims of mercenaries. Within the palace itself, intrigue multiplied. Ministers bought influence with bribes, courtiers whispered against rivals, and judges sought appointments not through reputation, but through purchase. Offices once given as rewards for merit were now sold to the highest bidder. Chroniclers describe men who, having purchased governorships, drained their provinces of wealth to recoup the cost. Corruption festered like rot in a fruit that looked perfect from the outside. Baghdad's citizens paid the price. The canals that fed the city fell into disrepair as funds were squandered. Irrigation faltered, crops withered, and hunger crept into households that had once known plenty. When bread prices rose, riots erupted. Crowds stormed bakeries. Guards clashed with the poor in alleys and squares, and the sense of a city under divine favor gave way to bitterness. For ordinary people, the caliph who once embodied justice had become a distant figure, hidden behind guards and dependent on generals. Even as Baghdad stumbled, provincial dynasties flourished. In Egypt, Ahmad ibn Tulun's heirs ruled like kings in all but name, raising armies, minting coins, and adorning Cairo with their own monuments. Across North Africa, the Abbasids sponsored fleets that carried Islam into Sicily, shaping Mediterranean history without waiting for approval from the caliph. In the east, the Samanids presided over a Persian Renaissance, celebrating poetry in their courts and reviving the Farsi tongue as a literary language. The caliph's name was still pronounced in Friday prayers, but the loyalty of these regions was no more than a polite nod. In Iraq itself, rebellion shook the land. The Zanj revolt had already scarred the marshes near Basra, but unrest did not end there. Tribes along the Euphrates resisted taxation. Villages deserted their fields, and discontent bubbled in the countryside. The state, weakened at its core, struggled to respond. The wealth that once flowed steadily into Baghdad slowed to a trickle, while provincial dynasties grew fat on revenues they kept for themselves. A new threat came not only from dynasties, but from sectarian challengers. The Karmatians, a radical Shia movement, erupted from eastern Arabia. They rejected the authority of the caliphs, denounced pilgrimage rituals, and raised their own banners. In 930 AD, they struck at the very heart of Islam, invading Mecca during the pilgrimage season. Pilgrims were slaughtered, and the black stone of the Kaaba was carried off in triumph. For 2 decades, the symbol of unity was missing from its shrine, and Baghdad could do nothing to restore it. To the faithful, this failure was devastating. The caliph, who styled himself as guardian of Islam's sanctuaries, could not even protect the holiest place of all. In the capital, the figure of the caliph diminished further. Ceremonies retained their pomp, but behind the glitter of processions, the sovereign lacked control. Al-Radi, ruling in the 930s, attempted to stabilize the situation by creating the office of Amir al-Umara, commander of commanders, granting one general sweeping authority over the army and administration. This decision was intended as a compromise, but it only confirmed what all already knew. The Caliph was no longer the master of his empire. The weakness of the center invited outsiders. From the mountains of Dalam in northern Persia came the Umayyads, fierce soldiers hardened by campaigns in rugged terrain. They swept across western Iran, asserting themselves as rulers in all but name. Baghdad's generals, consumed with factional rivalries, proved unable to resist. In 945 AD, Umayyad forces marched into the Round City. The Caliph remained enthroned, but only as a puppet. Real authority now rested in the hands of Umayyad emirs, who ruled while allowing the Abbasid name to survive for legitimacy. For Baghdad's people, the change was both shocking and strangely familiar. They had long suspected their caliphs no longer ruled. Now the truth was undeniable. The Abbasid Caliphate had been hollowed out, its grandeur preserved in ceremony while its power lay elsewhere. The Caliph recited prayers, affixed his seal to decrees, and presided over rituals. But the decisions that shaped lives were made by generals and governors beyond his reach. Still, culture endured. Poets continued to sing in Baghdad, copying their verses onto paper that spread from Cairo to Cordoba. The House of Wisdom still drew scholars, its halls filled with books and debates. Merchants carried the products of Baghdad's artisans across the known world. Even in decline, the city retained its allure. Travelers marveled at its size, its gardens, and its intellectual vibrancy. The Abbasids, though weakened, still embodied an ideal of civilization that commanded respect. This paradox defined the age. Politically, the Abbasid Caliph had become a shadow. Spiritually and culturally, he remained central. No provincial ruler dared omit the Caliph's name from the Friday sermon, nor would they strike coins without his title. The fiction of unity allowed them to cloak their independence in legitimacy. Baghdad, though no longer supreme, still mattered as the symbolic heart of Islam. The 10th century was an age of illusions carefully maintained. Behind the gilded walls, caliphs were captives of their guards. Beyond the capital, provinces thrived in near independence. At the Kaaba, the black stone lay missing. Yet in libraries and lecture halls, in mosques and markets, the Abbasid name still carried weight. Baghdad's supremacy had faded, but its prestige endured. It was no longer the commander of the Islamic world, but it remained its mirror, reflecting both its fractures and its brilliance. The Caliphate had become an emblem, fragile yet enduring, diminished in power yet luminous in memory. Morning light spilled across the domes of Baghdad, gilding a city that still called itself the capital of the world. Yet in distant North Africa, another power was rising, proclaiming a caliphate of its own. The Abbasids had once claimed universal leadership, the single voice for Islam's faithful. By the early 10th century, that claim was no longer unchallenged. A new dynasty, the Fatimids, had stepped onto the stage, armed not only with armies, but with ideology. The Fatimids traced their lineage not to Al-Abbas, as the Abbasids did, but to Fatima, daughter of the Prophet, and Ali, his cousin. Their claim struck at the heart of Abbasid legitimacy. If bloodline was the measure, the Fatimids argued, then their descent outranked all others. From secretive beginnings among Shia communities, they built a movement that blended religious zeal with political ambition. By 909 AD, their banners flew over North Africa, and a rival caliphate had been born. From the first, their propaganda sought to undermine Baghdad. Missionaries spread across the Islamic world, whispering in marketplaces, debating in mosques, distributing tracts that denounced the Abbasids as usurpers. Coins minted in Fatimid lands bore the names of their caliphs. Prayers in their territories invoked them instead of Baghdad's ruler. To hear two caliphs proclaimed in different corners of the Ummah was to feel the unity of Islam splinter. The Fatimid rise was more than rhetoric. They conquered swiftly, extending their reach from Tunisia across the Maghreb. Their fleets harried the Mediterranean, while their armies pressed eastward. In 969 AD, they achieved a triumph that shook the Abbasids to their core. The capture of Egypt. There, on the banks of the Nile, they founded a new capital, Cairo, which rivaled Baghdad in ambition. Its mosques gleamed, its markets bustled, and its scholars preached loyalty to Fatimid imams. Baghdad watched this with unease. The caliphs of the Abbasid house, already reduced to symbols under Buyid dominance, now faced an ideological adversary who claimed not only independence but superiority. The Fatimids positioned themselves as champions of Shia Islam, denouncing the Sunni orthodoxy that Baghdad defended. Pamphlets and sermons cast the Abbasids as illegitimate rulers, while Fatimid envoys carried their message deep into Abbasid lands. In response, the Abbasids leaned more heavily than ever on their role as guardians of Sunni faith. Baghdad became a citadel of Sunni scholarship, where jurists codified law, theologians debated doctrine, and preachers thundered against heresy. 4 major schools of Sunni law, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali, flourished, their scholars gathering disciples who would spread their teachings across the Islamic world. If the Abbasids could no longer command through armies, they would lead through creed. The rivalry between Baghdad and Cairo unfolded not only on battlefields, but in the realm of words. Fatimid dyes, missionaries, traveled as far as Yemen, Persia, even Baghdad itself, seeking converts. Abbasid authorities responded with their own preachers, their own networks of propaganda. The struggle was waged in pulpits as much as in fortresses, in the whispered persuasions of traders as much as in the clash of soldiers. And yet, Baghdad retained a magnetic pull. Despite its political decline, its cultural prestige remained unmatched. Students traveled there to study law and hadith, merchants to trade, poets to seek patronage. The city's reputation as the center of Sunni orthodoxy gave the Abbasid caliphs a spiritual authority that outlasted their military weakness. Even Fatimid Egypt, with all its splendor, could not erase the aura of Baghdad as the city of learning and tradition. Still, the cracks in unity widened. The Fatimids were not the only challengers. In Spain, the Umayyad dynasty descended from the prince who had fled Abbasid slaughter a century before, declared their own caliphate in Cordoba. By the mid-10th century, the Islamic world knew 3 rival claimants to universal leadership: Abbasids in Baghdad, Fatimids in Cairo, Umayyads in Cordoba. The unity once imagined under a single caliph was shattered beyond repair. For the faithful, the situation was bewildering. Pilgrims traveling to Mecca passed through lands where different caliphs were named in Friday prayers. Coins bore conflicting inscriptions. Scholars debated which caliph, if any, held true legitimacy. To stand in a mosque in Kairouan or Cordoba was to hear a sermon that denied Baghdad's authority. To worship in Baghdad was to hear denunciations of rivals. The very idea of a universal Islamic community, the Ummah, now seemed fractured into competing visions. Yet even in this contest, the Abbasids endured. Their enemies could conquer territory, but none could erase the symbolic power of Baghdad's name. The caliph remained a necessary figure for legitimacy. Sultans, governors, and dynasties still sought recognition from him, however hollow the gesture. The Abbasid caliph might be powerless in practice, but he was indispensable as a symbol of continuity. This period also revealed the resilience of Baghdad's scholars. As rulers quarreled, intellectual life persisted. Debates between theologians sharpened Sunni identity. Scholars penned treatises refuting Shia claims, while others defended the Abbasid vision of caliphal leadership as guardian rather than prophet. The rivalry with the Fatimids, though destructive politically, spurred a flowering of legal and theological thought that would shape Islamic orthodoxy for centuries. In Cairo, Fatimid caliphs paraded in splendor, their ceremonies dazzling onlookers. In Cordoba, Umayyad rulers built palaces and sponsored scholars to rival Baghdad's. Yet the Abbasid capital, though diminished, remained a touchstone. It was the city where the memory of Harun al-Rashid still glowed, where the House of Wisdom had once gathered the knowledge of the world, where Sunni law had taken its most enduring form. The caliphate had been fractured, but the Abbasid name endured as a thread, linking past grandeur to present struggle. No single dynasty could erase it. No rival could claim supremacy without reckoning with Baghdad's legacy. The Abbasids no longer held the reins of empire, but they remained the custodians of memory and the guardians of orthodoxy. By the middle of the 11th century, Baghdad's supremacy had been reduced to ceremony, yet ceremony itself mattered. In an age of rival caliphates, the Abbasids provided continuity, a reminder of Islam's earlier unity. Their survival as symbols allowed them to endure where mightier dynasties rose and fell. The challenge of the Fatimids revealed a truth that would define the next era. Political power could be seized, but spiritual authority was harder to dislodge. Baghdad's caliphs had lost much, but they had not lost everything. They remained, against all odds, the shadow of God on earth, diminished but not extinguished. The caliphate had become a hollow crown. Baghdad's ruler still led prayers and received ambassadors, but the power to command armies or collect taxes had long slipped away. Then, from the steppes of Central Asia, a new force arrived. A tide of Turkic warriors who swept across Iran and into Iraq. These were the Seljuks, and they came not to replace the Abbasids, but to cloak their own rule in the mantle of the caliphate. The Seljuks were nomads turned conquerors, hardened by life on horseback and bound by clan loyalties. In the early 11th century, they pressed westward, defeating rivals in Persia and capturing cities long out of Baghdad's reach. Their leader, Tugril Beg, understood that power alone was not enough. To rule the Islamic world, his victories needed legitimacy, and legitimacy still resided in the Abbasid Caliph, however weakened. When Tugril entered Baghdad in 1055 AD, he did so not as an enemy, but as a protector. The Caliph received him with ceremony, acknowledging him as Sultan, commander of worldly affairs, while the Caliph retained spiritual primacy. This arrangement created a dual order, the Abbasid Caliph as sacred symbol, the Seljuk Sultan as temporal master. The fiction suited both. The Caliph regained a measure of prestige under Seljuk arms. The Seljuks acquired the aura of divinely sanctioned rule. Under their shadow, Sunni Islam experienced a revival. The Seljuks presented themselves as champions of orthodoxy against both Shia rivals and heterodox sects. In Baghdad, scholars found new patrons, their madrasas endowed with Seljuk wealth. Nowhere was this more evident than in the work of Nizam al-Mulk, the great vizier who guided Seljuk policy for decades. He founded a network of schools, madrasas, across the empire, designed to train jurists in Sunni law and root out sectarian influence. These institutions spread learning and loyalty alike. binding cities from Nishapur to Damascus to the Sunni order. At the same time, thinkers like Al-Ghazali gave this revival intellectual depth. A scholar of dazzling range, Al-Ghazali struggled with philosophy, theology, and mysticism. He absorbed the works of Greek-influenced rationalists, then turned against them, declaring that reason must ultimately bow to revelation. Yet he also embraced Sufism, weaving spirituality into Sunni orthodoxy. His writings reconciled faith and mysticism, shaping Islamic thought for centuries. To students across the Islamic world, his words became guideposts, ensuring that the Abbasid-Seljuk partnership was not only political, but also spiritual. Baghdad itself reflected this transformation. Seljuk troops patrolled its streets, their banners fluttering above markets once filled with Persian administrators and Turkish guards. The Caliph, though still hemmed in by ceremony, basked in the renewed dignity provided by Seljuk arms. Crowds once again filled processions, cheering a caliph who, though powerless, seemed protected by God's will, manifested in foreign strength. The illusion of restored grandeur hung in the air. Yet illusions are fragile. The Seljuks were no monolith. Brothers quarreled, provinces pulled away, and local warlords tested their independence. Still, their presence provided a buffer that preserved the Abbasid caliphs from further humiliation. While Cairo glittered under Fatimid rule and Cordoba crumbled into Taifa kingdoms, Baghdad remained relevant. Its name still carried across pulpits as the heart of Sunni legitimacy. The partnership between caliph and sultan was uneasy. Abbasid rulers, though dependent, occasionally tested the boundaries. Caliph al-Muqtafi, ruling in the mid-12th century, asserted himself with surprising energy, raising his own troops and even venturing into campaigns. His boldness recalled, faintly, the days when caliphs commanded armies. For a brief moment, the throne seemed more than ceremonial. Yet the Seljuks loomed ever-present, and caliphal revival proved fleeting. Meanwhile, culture continued to thrive. Under Seljuk influence, Persian art and architecture flourished, leaving behind mosques with soaring domes and madrasas with intricate calligraphy. Baghdad remained a city of learning, but other centers, Isfahan, Nishapur, Damascus, rose in prominence, tied together by Seljuk patronage. The Abbasid Caliph was still invoked in each, yet increasingly as figurehead rather than initiator. The people of Baghdad experienced these changes in daily rhythms. They saw Seljuk horsemen clattering through narrow streets, foreign banners flying beside the caliphs. They heard sermons extolling Sunni unity, denouncing Fatimid claims. They attended new schools where jurists trained to defend orthodoxy, and they read treatises by Al-Ghazali that blended reason with devotion. The city had not regained its former supremacy, but it remained a stage where old traditions and new powers intertwined. The Seljuks, for all their strength, could not resolve every tension. Rival dynasties still held sway in far provinces. Shia communities resisted Sunni orthodoxy, and scholars continued to argue over the limits of reason. Yet for nearly a century, their guardianship gave the Abbasid caliphs a second life. The dynasty that had seemed on the brink of irrelevance survived, cloaked in borrowed strength, buoyed by Sunni revival, and kept at the heart of Islamic imagination. In the end, the Seljuks preserved what the Abbasids could not defend for themselves: the aura of universal leadership. Baghdad no longer ruled by sword or decree, but as a symbol around which orthodoxy rallied. The caliph's throne, hollowed of power, still glimmered with sanctity. And that sanctity, harnessed by Seljuk arms and Sunni scholarship, ensured that the Abbasid name would endure a while longer, even as history moved steadily toward new storms. news of the first Crusader armies reached Baghdad like a thunderclap. Pilgrims and merchants carried word of armored knights from distant lands, of Frankish soldiers marching beneath the sign of the cross. For a city accustomed to the ebb and flow of frontier wars, this invasion from the west was different. It was not Byzantiners seeking tribute, nor rebels claiming caliphal lineage, but a flood of warriors who saw themselves on a holy mission to capture the very heart of Islam. Yet when the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099 AD, slaughtering its inhabitants and turning its mosques into churches, the Abbasid caliphs could do little. Baghdad, still the seat of the caliphate, was weakened, hemmed in by Seljuk sultans who commanded the real armies. The caliph prayed for victory, dispatched letters of exhortation, and reminded the faithful of their duty, but he did not ride at the head of a host. Authority had shifted long before. The caliph's role was now symbolic, not martial. That symbolism, however, mattered. To Muslims across the empire, the voice of Baghdad still carried weight. Even as regional rulers, Seljuks in Syria, Atabegs in Mosul, emirs in Aleppo, took up the actual fighting, they did so in the name of the caliph. Banners were unfurled bearing his title. Sermons were preached invoking his legitimacy, and victories were celebrated as triumphs of Islam under his shadow. The caliph no longer wielded the sword, but his blessing turned battles into sacred struggle. The First Crusade revealed both the weakness and the resilience of the Abbasid throne. Militarily, Baghdad could not defend Jerusalem. Spiritually, it remained the axis around which the Islamic response revolved. That duality defined the century to come. As Crusader states entrenched themselves in the Levant, new Muslim leaders rose to challenge them. Among the earliest was Imad al-Din Zangi, lord of Mosul and Aleppo. Fierce and pragmatic, he captured Edessa in 1144 AD, striking the first real blow against the Crusaders. His victory reverberated across the Islamic world, stirring hopes of liberation. Yet even Zangi, proud and ambitious, sought legitimacy through Baghdad. He secured caliphal recognition, ensuring that his conquests were framed as service to the faith rather than personal aggrandizement. His successors carried the struggle further. Nur al-Din, Zangi's son, adorned Aleppo with mosques and schools, presenting himself as champion of Sunni Islam. He cultivated scholars, emphasized piety, and declared jihad against the Crusaders. Baghdad's caliphs, powerless to intervene directly, blessed his campaigns, lending the aura of legitimacy that made his victories resonate more deeply. The caliph's words were parchment. Nur al-Din's armies were steel. Together they sustained the idea of a unified struggle. From this lineage of leaders emerged the most famous of all, Saladin, a Kurdish commander who rose under Nur al-Din's service. Saladin established his own rule in Egypt before sweeping into Syria and uniting the front against the Crusaders. In 1187 AD, his forces recaptured Jerusalem, restoring the Dome of the Rock to Muslim worship and electrifying the Islamic world. Saladin's triumph became legend, but even he sought Baghdad's blessing. The caliph's letters praised him as defender of the faith, and poets linked his victory to the glory of the Abbasids. These alliances between generals and caliphs were never simple. Regional rulers wielded the power of arms. The Abbasids offered the legitimacy of continuity. Each needed the other. Without military strength, Baghdad risked irrelevance. Without caliphal sanction, emirs and sultans risked being seen as usurpers. Together they formed an uneasy partnership, each exploiting the other's weakness to reinforce their own claim. For ordinary Muslims, this arrangement mattered less than results. Pilgrims rejoiced when access to Jerusalem was restored. Merchants praised the reopening of trade routes. Scholars composed sermons celebrating victories as fulfillment of divine promise. The caliph's symbolic authority helped transform these events into moments of unity, binding distant provinces into a shared cause. Meanwhile, Baghdad itself remained a center of scholarship. While warriors fought in Syria and Palestine, jurists in the capital debated the laws of jihad, theologians argued over divine justice, and historians chronicled events with reverence and alarm. The city, though politically diminished, continued to act as a spiritual compass. News of Saladin's victory in Jerusalem was greeted with processions and prayers, as if the triumph had sprung from Baghdad itself. But reality could not be ignored. The Crusades underscored how far the Caliphate had fallen from its days of supremacy. The Caliph no longer appointed generals or directed campaigns. He blessed victories after the fact, but he did not shape them. To the faithful, his voice was still necessary. To rulers, his approval was still useful. Yet the days when the Caliph's command alone could summon armies were gone. The tension between authority and impotence shaped the Abbasid role during the Crusades. Caliphs attempted gestures of influence, correspondence with rulers, proclamations of jihad, symbolic gifts to commanders, but their actions carried the weight of tradition rather than command. It was enough to maintain reverence, but not enough to restore supremacy. Culturally, Baghdad flourished even amid political decline. Scholars such as Ibn al-Jawzi preached fiery sermons, weaving history and theology into calls for moral renewal. Jurists refined Sunni law, preserving it against both Shia rivals and Christian encroachment. The city's reputation as a beacon of scholarship outshone its political weakness. If Cairo dazzled with Fatimid ceremony and Aleppo bristled with fortresses, Baghdad remained unmatched as the schoolhouse of the Muslim world. The Crusades also deepened the divide between Sunni and Shia. Fatimid Cairo had once posed a rival caliphate, but as its power waned and Saladin restored Sunni rule in Egypt, Baghdad emerged once more as the uncontested spiritual capital for the Sunni world. In this, the Abbasids gained an indirect victory. Though they had not wielded the sword, the outcome of the Crusades reinforced their claim to embody Islam's enduring unity. By 1200 AD, the Abbasid caliphs stood as figures of paradox. They had not led the wars that defined the age, but they remained essential to their telling. Generals and sultans bent history with their armies, yet still deferred, however reluctantly, to the caliph's blessing. The throne of Baghdad was no longer a seat of empire, but it was still a pulpit of faith. The Crusades revealed how the Abbasids had adapted to survival. Once commanders of armies, they had become custodians of legitimacy. Once rulers of provinces, they had become guardians of memory. The age of conquest was behind them, but the age of authority through symbolism endured. And that symbolic power, fragile yet indispensable, would carry them forward into the final centuries of their long decline. The Abbasid Caliphate had survived centuries of storms, civil wars, sectarian uprisings, rival dynasties, and crusader onslaughts. Yet as the 13th century dawned, its survival carried a different meaning. The caliph still sat in Baghdad, presiding over ceremonies that evoked the memory of Harun al-Rashid. But their court no longer commanded empires. They had become custodians of tradition, guardians of an aura that no soldier's sword could deliver. Caliph al-Nasir, who reigned from 1180 to 1225 AD, made the boldest attempt to restore something of the old vigor. Unlike many of his predecessors, he did not accept the role of figurehead quietly. He promoted a revivalist movement known as the Futuwah, a brotherhood of chivalric and mystical associations. Its members pledged loyalty to the caliph, adopting rituals that blended Sufi devotion with military discipline. For a time, it seemed that al-Nasir might succeed in weaving together a network of urban guilds, mystics, and warriors into a force that could revitalize the caliphate. Ceremonies of the Fustuhwa filled Baghdad with pageantry, parades of initiates clad in green, oaths sworn in the caliph's name, and feasts where loyalty was celebrated as both spiritual and political devotion. Chroniclers describe al-Nasir himself as a shrewd politician, adept at exploiting rivalries among local dynasties, careful to present himself as Islam's supreme authority. Under his watch, the caliphate regained a measure of respect, yet even his success was fragile. The Futuwa remained more symbolic than military, a theatre of unity that could not withstand the raw power of sultans. Beyond Baghdad, stronger forces gathered. To the east, the Khwarezm Shahs built a realm of ambition, stretching from Iran to Central Asia. Their courts glittered with riches, their armies filled with hardened warriors. To the west, the Ayyubids, heirs of Saladin, dominated Egypt and Syria, wielding real authority while acknowledging the caliph only in form. Baghdad remained a stage for ritual. Cairo and elsewhere were arenas of power. Yet the Abbasid name retained its peculiar strength. The Khwarezm Shahs, for all their might, still sought investiture from Baghdad, eager to claim legitimacy through the caliph's blessing. The Ayyubids, despite their control of Jerusalem and Damascus, never dared abolish the caliphal name in sermons. The contradiction deepened. Rulers wielded the sword, but they needed the caliph's signature to make their power appear lawful. Baghdad survived in this twilight, diminished yet indispensable. Inside the round city, the people experienced a strange mixture of splendor and decay. The markets still filled with spices, silks, and paper. Scholars still lectured in mosques. Poets still praised their patrons. But canals were choked with silt, irrigation faltered, and fields lay abandoned. Tax burdens grew harsh, and provincial revenues increasingly slipped into the coffers of local rulers rather than Baghdad's treasury. The caliphate presided over culture, not over prosperity. Even so, Baghdad remained the intellectual beacon of Sunni Islam. Scholars gathered there from across the Islamic world, debating theology and law. Libraries swelled with manuscripts, preserving the heritage of centuries. Theologians continued to refine Sunni orthodoxy, sharpening distinctions from Shia rivals. The city projected prestige, even as its foundations weakened. The Abbasid caliphs also tried to shore up their image through diplomacy. Envoys traveled to distant courts, carrying letters that proclaimed Baghdad's spiritual authority. Alliances were sought with Ayyubid sultans, treaties signed with Khwarezm Shahs. At times, these gestures succeeded in reminding rivals that the caliph's blessing was still a prize worth seeking. At other times, they revealed only how little the caliphs could actually command. The looming danger, however, came not from the west or from Cairo, but from the east. Rumors filtered into Baghdad of a new force sweeping across Asia, horsemen from the steppes, ruthless and relentless. They were the Mongols, whose conquests had already toppled kingdoms in Central Asia and brought ruin to cities that had once seemed impregnable. At first, Baghdad watched with curiosity, then with dread. By the 1220s, stories of Mongol destruction spread like wildfire. Witnesses described entire cities leveled, populations massacred, rivers choked with bodies. The Khwarezmian Empire, once a rival power, was shattered in a storm of fire and blood. Refugees poured westward, carrying tales of horror to Baghdad's markets and mosques. The caliphate's weakness was laid bare. It could neither aid the victims nor repel the threat. Al-Nasir's revival had given hope. But after his death, the Abbasid throne slid back into inertia. His successors lacked his energy. Caliphs like al-Zahir and al-Mustansir presided over ceremonies and construction projects, mosques, schools, even hospitals. But their reigns were remembered more for cultural ornament than political achievement. Baghdad gained monuments, yet its defenses remained neglected. Al-Mustansir, who reigned from 1226 to 1242, built the Mustansiriya Madrasa, a great college that brought together the 4 Sunni legal schools under one roof. It was a monument to learning and orthodoxy, an architectural jewel meant to remind the world of Baghdad's spiritual preeminence. Students from across the Islamic world flocked to its halls, studying law, medicine, and theology. The madrasa embodied the caliphate's role in these years, guardian of memory, not master of empire. Even as learning flourished, anxiety deepened. Merchants spoke of Mongol envoys demanding submission from rulers who trembled before them. Scholars debated whether this new storm was a divine punishment for disunity. The caliphs, clinging to ceremony, offered prayers for protection, but their armies were weak, their treasury drained, and their authority hollow. The twilight of Abbasid power carried a bitter irony. They had endured longer than any dynasty could have imagined, outlasting Umayyads, Fatimids, and Seljuks. Yet their survival was not victory, but dependence. On sultans for arms, on scholars for prestige, on memory for relevance. Baghdad remained a beacon of culture, but the flames of war drew closer. By the middle of the 13th century, the caliphate had become a paradox. It was admired for its learning, revered for its continuity, celebrated in ritual, yet politically irrelevant, militarily helpless, economically strained. The Mongols, advancing step by step, would soon test whether even prestige and sanctity could preserve a throne that no longer commanded force. The Abbasids stood like guardians of a memory, shining in ceremony even as shadows lengthened. Their age was not yet finished, but the storm gathering beyond the horizon promised an end more sudden and terrible than any they had endured before. Winter clouds hung low over Mesopotamia when the horsemen of Hulagu Khan approached the plains of Iraq. They came not as raiders, but as an army vast beyond reckoning, banners whipping in the wind, catapults hauled across frozen ground, regiments of archers in endless lines. To those who had fled before them from Persia, their arrival carried one meaning only: destruction. The Mongols had burned cities to the ground, slaughtered entire populations, and left rivers clogged with corpses. Now their gaze had fixed upon Baghdad, jewel of the Abbasids, city of scholars, poets, and caliphs. Inside the round city, fear mixed with disbelief. For centuries, the Abbasid throne had endured crises that would have shattered lesser dynasties. Surely, many reasoned, it would endure again. The caliph, al-Musta'sim, sat in his palace surrounded by courtiers who told him what he wished to hear, that the Mongols could be bargained with, that their armies were stretched thin, that Baghdad's walls were strong enough to withstand any assault. Scholars prayed for deliverance, merchants hoarded supplies, common folk whispered of omens. Yet preparations were half-hearted, the city ill-defended, its rulers trapped in a haze of false confidence. Hulagu's envoys had demanded submission. Al-Musta'sim hesitated, then refused, convinced that God would not abandon the city of the caliphs. His decision sealed Baghdad's fate. The Mongols advanced methodically, cutting canals, destroying villages, and tightening their grip. By January of 1258, they encircled the city, their siege engines looming against the horizon like wooden giants. The bombardment began with thunderous force. Stones crashed into walls, towers splintered, and the cries of the wounded echoed through Baghdad's streets. Day after day, Mongol catapults rained destruction, while engineers undermined defenses. Within, food dwindled and morale collapsed. Chroniclers speak of panic, of neighborhoods torn apart by fire, of citizens pleading in vain for stronger leadership. When the walls finally gave way, the storm broke with merciless speed. Mongol troops surged through the breaches, cutting down defenders, pouring into markets and mosques. Baghdad, city of light, city of books, city of memory, fell in a tide of iron and flame. The massacre that followed became legend. For days, perhaps weeks, the killing did not cease. Men, women, and children alike perished in streets that ran red with blood. Palaces were looted, libraries set ablaze, scholars butchered alongside soldiers. The House of Wisdom, guardian of centuries of knowledge, was cast into ruin. Some accounts claim its books were hurled into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink, a dark mirror of the blood that already stained its waters. Al-Musta'asim was captured alive. Hulagu, contemptuous of caliphal sanctity, mocked the man who had once been shadow of God on earth. In stories repeated by generations, the caliph was executed in a manner that avoided spilling royal blood on the ground, rolled into a carpet and trampled by horses, crushed as his dynasty was crushed. With him ended not only a life, but the authority of Baghdad as the capital of Islam. The devastation stunned the world. Muslim chroniclers, accustomed to describing victories and defeats, struggled to find words equal to the catastrophe. The greatest city of its age lay silent, its mosques empty, its markets ruined. Irrigation canals, painstakingly maintained for centuries, were destroyed, turning fields into wastelands. Survivors fled through ruins haunted by smoke and carrion birds. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was no more. For centuries, Baghdad had stood as a symbol of Islam's unity, a place where knowledge and empire intertwined. Its fall felt like the unraveling of a cosmic order. Pilgrims wept at the desecration of the Caliphate's seat. Poets lamented the silence of libraries. Preachers thundered that the disaster was punishment for corruption and disunity. In Cairo, in Damascus, in distant Andalusia, the news carried shockwaves. And yet, even amid ruin, the Abbasid name did not die. Fragments of the dynasty escaped the slaughter, carried east and south, preserved by memory and lineage. Within 3 years, Cairo would welcome a descendant to serve as ceremonial caliph under Mamluk protection. But Baghdad itself, once unrivaled, never recovered its preeminence. The Mongol conquest marked more than the death of a dynasty's power. It was the symbolic end of an age. The Abbasid Golden Era, which had nurtured scholars, scientists, poets, and philosophers, closed in fire. The irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamia since ancient times lay in ruins, leaving the land impoverished for generations. The Tigris, once the lifeline of empire, became a grave for knowledge and lives alike. No city had embodied the dream of Islam's universal empire more than Baghdad. No destruction seemed more complete than its fall. To later generations, the memory of 1258 became a wound carried in chronicles, sermons, and stories. It was not simply a defeat, but a rupture in history, the moment when the heart of the Islamic world was silenced by horsemen from the steppe. The Abbasids had outlasted rivals and survived centuries of decline, but they could not withstand the Mongol storm. What armies and sects had failed to do, Hulagu accomplished in weeks. The Caliphate's light, once so radiant, was extinguished in smoke and blood. The ruins of Baghdad stood as monument and warning that no city however splendid, no dynasty, however venerable, was safe from the tides of history. The Golden Age had ended, not with a fading whisper, but with a roar of destruction that echoed across the world. In the ashes of Baghdad, few could imagine that the Abbasid name would live again. The Mongols had crushed the Caliphate in 1258, reducing its palaces to rubble, scattering its scholars, and extinguishing its throne. Chroniclers wrote of the calamity as though history itself had ended. Yet dynasties are not so easily erased. Within 3 years, the Abbasid line resurfaced, not in Mesopotamia, but in the heart of Egypt, sheltered by the rising power of the Mamluks. The Mamluks were former slaves turned rulers, warriors of Turkic and Circassian stock who had seized control of Cairo after toppling the Ayyubid dynasty. Fierce in battle and disciplined in command, they lacked one thing: the aura of legitimacy. A caliph could provide it, and fortune offered them one. A surviving Abbasid prince, al-Mustansir, had fled westward and found refuge in Egypt. In 1261, he was ceremonially installed in Cairo as Caliph of Islam. His reign was brief and tragic. Hoping to reclaim Baghdad, he led an expedition eastward, only to fall in battle against Mongol forces. His death left the Mamluks with a dilemma. The Abbasid name was too valuable to discard, yet no caliph could truly wield power. Their solution was elegant. They enthroned another Abbasid relative, al-Hakim I, but restricted him to ceremonial duties. Henceforth, the Abbasid caliphs of Cairo would be spiritual figureheads, while the Mamluk sultans commanded armies, levied taxes, and shaped policy. The arrangement suited both. The Mamluks draped their rule in Abbasid prestige, presenting themselves as defenders of Islam under the blessing of the caliph. The Abbasid figure in Cairo, though stripped of power, lived amid respect, performing rituals, blessing appointments, and lending continuity to the Islamic world. The partnership turned Cairo into the new symbolic capital of Sunni Islam, a beacon that rivaled Baghdad's lost glory. Ceremonies in Cairo carried echoes of the past. The caliph led prayers on Fridays in the great mosques, his name proclaimed in sermons across Egypt and beyond. Envoys from distant lands still sought his recognition, for a decree sealed with the Abbasid title carried weight. When the Mamluk sultans fought the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, halting their westward expansion, they did so under banners sanctified by the caliph. Victories could be claimed as triumphs of Islam, not merely of generals. Yet everyone knew the truth. The Abbasid caliphs of Cairo were shadows of their ancestors. They did not command armies, shape policy, or control provinces. They lived at the mercy of their protectors, valued for their lineage, not their power. Their role was symbolic, to remind the Muslim world that the line of al-Abbas still endured, that the caliphate had not vanished entirely. For nearly 3 centuries, this fiction held. While Mamluk sultans ruled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, Abbasid caliphs lent their names to proclamations. They crowned sultans, legitimized treaties, and issued decrees that were drafted by others. Some were scholars in their own right, respected for piety or learning. Others lived in obscurity, their lives barely noted in chronicles. Yet the dynasty's survival mattered. In a fragmented world, the Abbasid name was a thread that tied the present to a golden past. Cairo itself flourished as a center of power and culture, its skyline filled with mosques, madrasas, and minarets, many commissioned by the Mamluk elite. Scholars gathered in its libraries, merchants thronged its markets, pilgrims passed through on their way to Mecca. The presence of a caliph, however ceremonial, gave the city a spiritual weight that even victorious conquerors like the Mongols could not claim. The Abbasids in Cairo also became useful tools in the politics of legitimacy. When rival dynasties sought recognition, they turned to the caliph. Mamluk sultans staged grand ceremonies where caliphs draped them with robes of honor, reaffirming the fiction that authority still flowed from the Abbasid throne. The arrangement mirrored, in diminished form, the partnership once forged between caliphs and Seljuk sultans centuries earlier. But this time, the imbalance was total. The caliphate existed solely to sanctify the rule of others. Still, the symbolism carried weight. To ordinary believers, the knowledge that a caliph still lived, descendant of the Prophet's uncle, bearer of continuity, offered reassurance. The memory of Baghdad's fall had left scars, and the survival of the Abbasids, however diminished, softened the wound. Poets in Cairo spoke of the caliph as the light of continuity, a fragile flame kept alive amid storms. As the centuries turned, the Abbasid caliphs in Cairo became increasingly obscure. Chroniclers devoted more ink to the deeds of Mamluk sultans than to the figureheads in their palaces. Yet the dynasty endured generation after generation, each caliph succeeded by another, each lending legitimacy to rulers who held the sword. The line persisted, not because of its power, but because of its usefulness. The final chapter came with the rise of a new empire. In Anatolia and the Balkans, the Ottomans expanded with relentless energy, conquering Constantinople in 1453 and claiming the mantle of world power. As their armies pressed southward, Egypt became their inevitable prize. In 1517, Sultan Selim the Grim defeated the Mamluks, marched into Cairo, and brought the Abbasid Caliph with him into custody. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some traditions claim that the last Abbasid Caliph in Cairo, Al-Mutawakkil III, formally transferred the symbols of authority, the Prophet's cloak and sword, to Selim, acknowledging the Ottoman sultans as caliphs. Whether this ceremony occurred exactly as later chroniclers described, its meaning was clear. The Abbasid line in Cairo had ended, and a new dynasty now claimed the mantle of universal leadership. With that, the Abbasids, who had first risen in Khorasan in 750 AD, who had built Baghdad and presided over Islam's golden age, who had survived decline, rival caliphates, and Mongol catastrophe, finally passed into history. They had ruled as emperors, endured as symbols, and lingered as shadows. For nearly 8 centuries, their name had defined the caliphate. What remained was legacy. The Abbasids had given the Islamic world Baghdad, the house of wisdom, and a flowering of science, medicine, and philosophy that shaped civilizations far beyond their own. They had preserved the memory of unity even when power was lost. And in Cairo, they had ensured that the caliphate's name, if not its might, outlasted catastrophe. Their survival in diminished form carried its own significance. In times of fracture and conquest, they embodied continuity. In eras of turmoil, they reminded believers that the caliphate had not died entirely. And in their eventual eclipse by the Ottomans, they passed on a mantle that would continue to shape the Islamic imagination for centuries more. From the banks of the Zab to the banks of the Nile, from the triumph of al-Safa to the exile of al-Mutawakkil, the Abbasid story was one of rise, brilliance, fracture, and survival. Their golden age had ended in fire, but their name endured in memory and ritual until another empire claimed their inheritance. The Abbasids did not vanish in silence. They left echoes that resound through history. Their survival in Cairo, though stripped of power, ensured that their dynasty was the longest-lasting caliphate in Islam's story, an unbroken line of continuity stretching across centuries. In the end, their greatest triumph was endurance itself, the ability to embody the idea of the caliphate even when empire was gone.